There are relationships that grow you, and there are relationships that erase you. The second kind is subtle. It doesn't start with shouting or slamming doors. It starts with you lowering your voice, ignoring your intuition, justifying what you know feels wrong. And before you know it, you're not you anymore. You're just what they needed you to be. Carl Jung believed that the psyche speaks through patterns. And if you look closely, toxic relationships aren't random. They're patterned. Repeating wounds, recycled shadows, unhealed needs masquerading as love. Let's start with the first sign. 1. You feel like you're too much for wanting basic respect. You ask to be heard. You want to be considered. You say, "That hurt me." And instead of empathy, you get shame. Why are you so sensitive? You're always starting something. You take things too personally. Over time, you internalize the idea that your needs are a burden. You stop asking. You shrink. But Jung would tell you, your sensitivity is not weakness. It's a message, a signal that something's not safe, something's not aligned. If you have to shrink to be loved, it's not love. It's survival. 2. You apologize for things you didn't do. You say sorry when they're upset, sorry when you set a boundary, sorry when you didn't answer fast enough. In a toxic dynamic, guilt is currency. They make you pay for their discomfort with your peace. And slowly, you begin to believe you're always the problem. That maybe if you were better, they'd be happier. But Jungian psychology reminds us that guilt can be misplaced, especially when it's learned from repeated emotional manipulation. You don't need to be guilty for protecting your mental health. 3. You feel emotionally drained after every interaction. Love is not supposed to feel like recovery. If being around someone regularly leaves you tired, confused, or anxious, it's not a coincidence. Your nervous system doesn't lie. A toxic relationship will keep you in a near constant state of hypervigilance. You're walking on eggshells, reading tone, overthinking every message. And the worst part? You start calling that normal. Carl Jung emphasized that the unconscious becomes destiny if it's not brought into awareness. You can't heal what you normalize. You can't break free from what you call love when it's actually fear. 4. You forget what you like when you're with them. At first, it's little things. You skip your music to play theirs. You dress differently to avoid comments. You stop bringing up topics they roll their eyes at. But eventually, you forget who you were before them. Your identity becomes background noise in their story. And here's what Jung would say. This isn't love, it's enmeshment. It's the loss of self under the illusion of unity. You weren't made to be absorbed. You were made to be witnessed. 5. You're always explaining yourself, but they never really listen. You start every sentence with, "What I meant was." You find yourself rehearsing texts. You write paragraphs, only to get one-word replies. And it's not that you're unclear, it's that they're not interested in understanding. In toxic dynamics, the conversation isn't about truth. It's about control. They don't want clarity. They want you to question yourself. Carl Jung believed that communication is not just words, it's energy. If you're constantly explaining your intentions but still being painted as the villain, it's not miscommunication, it's manipulation. Because in healthy relationships, being misunderstood isn't a weapon. It's an opportunity to understand each other deeper. In toxic ones, your truth is twisted into ammunition. 6. You're afraid to be happy without them. Maybe you finally had a good day. You laughed. You felt light. You remembered what peace feels like. But instead of sharing it, you hesitate. You know what's coming. Jealousy, dismissal, punishment disguised as sarcasm. They don't celebrate your joy unless it revolves around them. And so you shrink your light, dull your happiness, apologize for your success. That's not love. That's possession. Jung would say this points to a shadow dynamic, where your growth threatens their illusion of control, where your independence is perceived as abandonment. But real love, it doesn't punish freedom, it honors it. 7. You don't recognize yourself anymore, but you're afraid to leave. You used to laugh louder, sleep deeper, dream bigger. Now you just survive. You feel like a ghost in your own life, a version of you stuck in someone else's emotional orbit. And yet, leaving feels impossible, not because you love them, but because you've forgotten how to be without them. That's the hook of toxic love. It doesn't just break your heart, it rewires your identity. Carl Jung taught that the persona, the mask we wear to navigate the world, can become a prison. And in toxic relationships, you're not just wearing a mask, you've become it. But here's the truth. If you had the strength to lose yourself for someone else, you have the strength to find yourself again. If this sounds like your story, not in detail but in the ache behind the silence, you're not imagining it, you're remembering. There's no rush, no fixing, just space to feel, to notice, to keep unfolding. And if this moment feels right, there's more to explore. Other voices, other pieces of you reflected in stories not so different from this one. You can pause here, or keep going. Depthora is always open. Healing doesn't begin when they apologize. It begins when you stop waiting for one. Because the closure you need isn't a sentence from them. It's a decision from you. You can't go back and rewrite the past, but you can choose what happens next. And here's where the real work starts. You begin to unlearn your silence, the one that was rewarded with peace, the one that kept you safe but cost you your voice. You speak now, awkwardly at first, maybe too softly, but each word is a step home. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Leaving a toxic relationship brings all that unconscious pain to the surface, and it's overwhelming. You start asking, how did I stay so long? Why didn't I see it? Was any of it even real? But these questions aren't signs you're broken. They're signs you're waking up. Because real healing doesn't look like strength. It looks like crying when you thought you'd moved on. It looks like missing the routine more than the person. It looks like deleting the messages and still hearing their voice in your head. That's not weakness. That's the nervous system detoxing from emotional chaos. Be gentle. You're not just grieving a person. You're grieving who you became to survive them. And as you grieve, something else happens. You start remembering what joy used to feel like, what safety sounds like in your own voice, what it means to make a choice that doesn't require permission. You begin to notice subtle things. You sleep better. Your body feels lighter. You laugh without scanning the room. You take longer showers without guilt. You stop apologizing for being quiet, for being slow, for being yourself. These are the signs. Tiny, sacred signs that your identity is coming back. Jung called this process individuation, becoming who you truly are, apart from roles, masks, and survival instincts. And individuation doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in the soft rebellion of saying, I don't owe you access to me anymore. Here's how you know you're healing. You no longer fantasize about changing them. You no longer need to be right. You stop explaining why you left. You start enjoying your own company. You look in the mirror and don't flinch. And maybe for the first time, you feel whole without anyone completing you. Because you were never half of anything. You were always complete, just forgotten. So what now? Now you build a life that doesn't apologize for existing. You surround yourself with people who don't need you to shrink. You create without permission. You rest without guilt. You love without performing. And when someone asks, what happened to you? You smile and say, I remembered who I was before I had to forget. Healing doesn't just mean you've left the relationship. It means the relationship has left you. It's no longer echoing in your choices. It's not scripting your silence. It's not sitting in your nervous system, making you flinch at healthy love. Because survival isn't healing. It's the space between. Jung called this the return to the self. Not the persona you crafted to keep the peace. Not the ego you used to stay in control. The self, raw, whole, unedited. And the return is quiet. You're not shouting, I've healed. You're no longer obsessed with proving you're over them. You just stop thinking about them altogether. That's how you know it's real. But before that, there's a middle phase, the rebuilding. And rebuilding starts with trust, not in them, not even in people, but in yourself. Trusting your own perception. Trusting your body when it says, this feels wrong. Trusting your voice when it says, I need space. Trusting your past without hating it. Because the version of you that stayed, they weren't weak. They were surviving with the tools they had. Honor them. They kept you alive long enough to become this version. The one who sees clearly. The one who chooses peace even when chaos begs louder. The one who doesn't confuse guilt with love anymore. Here's what rebuilding actually looks like. You say no and don't apologize. You rest before you burn out. You feel sad and don't label it weakness. You walk away and don't look back for applause. You stop arguing with people who live in denial. You stop translating your needs into languages that hurt you to speak. And most of all, you stop saving people who drown you while calling it love. Carl Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And now you see it. That's why they hated your silence. That's why they mocked your boundaries. That's why your healing triggered their rage. You weren't just changing, you were reflecting. And they couldn't face what they saw. But you kept going. You sat through the ache. You shook through the panic. You cried in quiet rooms and still got up the next day. You kept choosing yourself. Not because it was easy, but because you knew the only way out was through. And now you're different. You don't settle. You don't chase. You don't need to be needed. You are okay being misunderstood. You are okay being alone. You are okay not performing. That's real power. That's the self Jung spoke of. And once you touch it, you don't go back. There's a part of you they never saw, not because you hid it, but because it scared them. The part that questioned, the part that didn't agree, the part that wanted more than survival. You silenced it to keep the peace, buried it to preserve connection, but it never disappeared. That part is your shadow. Carl Jung didn't see the shadow as evil. He saw it as repressed potential. The pieces of you the world told you were too much, too loud, too soft, too sensitive. In toxic relationships, the shadow is what you compromise first. Your boldness, your needs, your instincts. And the longer you stay, the more invisible you become. Because when your presence threatens their illusion, they convince you to shrink. But now that you've left, something strange happens. That shadow comes back. And at first, it's messy. You feel anger when you thought you were forgiving. You feel rage where you were supposed to feel peace. You want distance even from those who mean well. Don't panic. You're not getting worse. You're getting real. You're not regressing. You're reclaiming. Because healing isn't about becoming palatable to everyone else. It's about becoming whole for yourself. The shadow holds your voice, your truth, your wildness, your fire. And now you have space to meet it again. This is the integration Jung spoke of, bringing back the parts of you that were exiled to be accepted. It's not always graceful. Sometimes it means saying no without explaining. Sometimes it means leaving a room when it's still full. Sometimes it means choosing your peace over their validation. But each time you do that, something changes. You become solid. You stop chasing people who misunderstand your boundaries. You stop editing your joy to make others comfortable. You stop craving connection that costs your clarity. You start walking like someone who belongs to themselves. And it shows. People say you've changed. They're right. Because you no longer offer pieces of yourself in exchange for crumbs. You no longer mistake chaos for passion. You no longer need pain to feel something. That's evolution. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And now, you're not just surviving relationships, you're mastering them. Not by manipulating, not by winning arguments, but by knowing when to walk away. You no longer fight for closure. You no longer rehearse how to be lovable. You simply are. Because the version of you that lives in alignment, they don't need to be explained. They need to be protected. And that's your job now. Not to convince others of your worth, but to live it so fully, their approval becomes irrelevant. That's what the shadow gives you when you stop fearing it. Your power back. You've left the room. You've walked away from the chaos, the shame, the endless explaining. But healing doesn't end at the door. It begins in the silence after. And that silence, it's terrifying at first. You sit alone and wonder, was I the problem? Did I make it all up? Maybe it wasn't that bad. That's the echo of emotional confusion. That's what they left behind. It's not them speaking anymore. It's the voice they trained inside you. But here's what you need to know. You're not broken. You're just detoxing from dysfunction. Carl Jung said, loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important. You were lonely in that relationship because you couldn't be real. Now you can. And it won't feel like magic. It'll feel like work. Like building trust with yourself from scratch. Like reintroducing yourself to peace. Like remembering who you were before the survival kicked in. You'll have days where you miss them. But what you really miss is who you hoped they would become. That hope is gone now. But something better is rising in its place. Clarity. Clarity is quiet. It doesn't beg. It doesn't chase. It doesn't need closure that hurts to hold. It just says, I see it now, and that's enough. And once you see clearly, you choose differently. You no longer open your heart to confusion. You no longer explain your worth to those committed to misunderstanding you. You no longer call pain growth just to survive it. Instead, you build boundaries before you're broken. You leave at the first sign of disrespect. You protect your peace like it's sacred, because it is. This is where your power lives now, not in your ability to endure chaos, but in your decision to never entertain it again. Because the version of you that stayed, they weren't foolish. They were loyal. But now you understand. Loyalty without reciprocity is just self-abandonment in disguise. You deserve more than someone who needs you broken to love you. You deserve stillness, safety, someone who doesn't confuse silence with weakness, someone who doesn't punish honesty, someone who sees your full self and stays. But before anyone else does that, you do. You stay. You sit with your discomfort without running. You validate your pain without minimizing it. You hold yourself through the waves. You stop looking for home in people who only offer shelter during the storm. You remember, you are not hard to love. You were just trying to be loved by someone who never learned how. So breathe. You made it out. You're here. You're healing. And not healing to be perfect. Healing to be whole. Carl Jung called this the return to the self. And you, my friend, are almost there. If this felt familiar, maybe not in words, but in the silence between them, you're not alone. Sometimes it takes one voice to remind us of our own. And when you're ready, there are more moments waiting, more pieces of you to meet, more truths to remember. Stay, explore, let your healing be witnessed.